Hello and welcome to the Lincoln Journey. Today is episode 20 of The Conspirators, in which we spend even more time on the only defendant who was found to be, in fact, not one of the conspirators. We've looked at some of the evidence produced against Edmund Spangler, but there were people who spoke out for him. They weren't always the best references, however. Some of them were other defendants, actually. But none of these had anything to gain by exonerating Spangler. First, when Sam Arnold was being returned to Baltimore after his arrest at Fortress Monroe, he traveled on the same boat as Ford's theater owner John Ford. Arnold claimed that no theater employees were involved in the plot, much to Ford's gratification. Second, George Port Tobacco Atzerodt wrote out several pages of a confession the night before he was executed, claiming he was in for the abduction but never agreed to the murders. When he explained that a coil of rope left at Surrattsville was to stretch across the road to trip the cavalry, he seems to be reminded of Spangler's rope and writes, "I know nothing about Spangler's rope. I believe him innocent." However, neither of these men could know for certain whether Booth involved Spangler without telling them. Third, Spangler came up in the interrogation of Davy Harold after he was captured. Shown some pictures, he recognized Ned as the carpenter who attended to Booth's horses in the stable behind the theater. Here's a snippet from the conversation. Question: Did you see the carpenter the Friday before you left town? Answer: I have not seen that carpenter for, I believe, 6 weeks. I will tell you what Booth did say. He said there was a man at the theater that held his horse that he was sorry for. Question: Did he say what man it was? Answer: He did say his name, and if I were to hear it, I would know it. Booth said it might get him into difficulty. As a whole, Harold's voluntary statement is a litany of self-serving lies served up with some demonstrable facts. This tidbit is something in between. It doesn't benefit Harold, but even if true, it's not an unmixed exoneration of Spangler. Still, while Spangler's co-defendants couldn't prove for a fact that he wasn't their co-conspirator, the members of the military commission, after weighing all of their evidence, came to that conclusion themselves. However, they found Spangler guilty of aiding and abetting Booth after the shooting. How did they decide that? You might think that it was largely on the testimony of Jacob Rittersbach, who claimed that Ned slapped him and told him not to say which way Booth went. But it was more in spite of Rittersbach's testimony than because of it that Spangler was convicted. Most of the credit goes to Joseph B. Stewart, a lawyer and Union Army officer who was sitting in the front row of Ford's theater while Our American Cousin was being performed. After the shooting, he leaped onto the stage to pursue Booth. This much is not in dispute, but his detailed description of the pursuit seems almost fantastical, and his evidence against Spangler is so flimsy and so contradictory to the testimony of others, including Rittersbach, that I am flabbergasted that the commission took it seriously. So, I'm going to give some excerpts from Stewart's testimony and insert editorial comments. Stewart says of Booth, "He came down with his back slightly toward the audience, but rising and turning, his face came in full view. At the same instant, I jumped on the stage." He actually had to get past the orchestra pit first. "And the man disappeared at the left-hand stage entrance. I ran across the stage as quickly as possible, followed the direction he took, calling out, 'Stop that man,' 3 times. When about 20 or 25 feet from the door through which the man ran, the door slammed to and closed. Coming up to the door, I touched it first on the side where it did not open, after which I caught hold of the proper place, opened the door, and passed out." If only the door hadn't slammed shut and hadn't been so confusing, as we shall see. The last time that I exclaimed, "Stop that man," someone said, "He is getting on a horse at the door." And almost as soon as the words reached my ears, I heard the tramping of a horse. On opening the door, after the temporary balk, but what a critically time-consuming balk, I perceived a man mounting a horse. The moon was just beginning to rise, and I could see anything elevated better than near the ground. The horse was moving with a quick, agitated motion, as a horse will do when prematurely spurred in mounting, with the reins drawn a little to one side, and for a moment I noticed the horse describe a kind of circle from the right to the left. I ran in the direction where the horse was heading, and when within 8 or 10 feet from the head of the horse and almost up within reach of the left flank, the rider brought him round somewhat in a circle from the left to the right, crossing over, the horse's feet rattling violently on what seemed to be rocks. I crossed in the same direction, aiming at the rein, and was now on the right flank of the horse. He was rather gaining on me then, though not yet in a forward movement. I could have reached his flank with my hand when, perhaps 2/3 of the way over the alley, again he backed to the right side of the alley, brought the horse forward, and spurred him. At the same instant he crouched forward, down over the pommel of the saddle. The horse then went forward and soon swept rapidly to the left, up toward F Street. I still ran after the horse some 40 or 50 yards and commanded the person to stop. All this occupied only the space of a few seconds. A few seconds? Does this include the part where he shouted, "Stop that man," 3 times? Or just the part where the horse was moving right to left, then left to right, then rattling violently on what seemed to be rocks? And another question. Was there closed-circuit TV in that alley? How does he remember every detail? Now we get to the part that is purportedly about Spangler. Near the door on my right hand I saw a person standing who seemed to be in the act of turning and who did not seem to be moving about like the others. Everyone else that I saw but this person seemed intensely excited, literally bewildered. They were all in a terrible commotion and moving about, except this man. Stewart was then asked if he recognized this person among the prisoners. "That man," pointing to Spangler, "looks more like the person I saw near the door than anybody else I see here." What a damning identification. He continues, "When the assassin alighted on the stage, I believed I knew who it was that had committed the deed, that it was J. Wilkes Booth, and I so informed Richards, superintendent of the police, that night." Remember that name. "I knew Booth by sight very well, and when I was running after him, I had no doubt in my mind that it was Booth, and should have been surprised to find that it was anybody else. I felt a good deal vexed at his getting away, and had no doubt when I started across the stage that I could catch him." He goes on to say that the person he saw might have stopped Booth if he had cared to. When cross-examined by Spangler's lawyer, he said this: "The man I have spoken of stood about 3 feet from the door out of which Booth passed. I noticed him just after the door slammed. From the position in which he stood, he might have slammed it without my noticing it. The lock of the door, as I approached it, was on the right-hand side, the hinges to the left. If the door had been open and I had not been stopped, I could have got the range of the horse outside." So, poor Joseph Stewart, and poor us, that this man who looked more like Edmund Spangler than any of the other 7 defendants, including Mary Surratt, might have slammed the door without Stewart noticing it, thus preventing the apprehension of the assassin. However, other testimony contradicts Stewart. Rittersbach, no friend of Spangler, said that he, Rittersbach, and Stewart arrived at the door at the same time, that he, not Stewart, opened the door, and he said that Spangler wasn't there. "When I heard the pistol fired, I was standing in the center of the stage, listening to the play," Rittersbach testified, "and Spangler was at the same place, just about ready to shove off the scenes. I stood nearest the door. I am certain we both stood there when the pistol was fired. I did not at first know what had happened. When I came back, Spangler was at the same place where I had left him. That's when they had the exchange in which Spangler struck Rittersbach. That blow may have indicated sympathy with Booth, but it doesn't prove complicity. The testimony of others describing Booth's escape agrees in general with Rittersbach and largely contradicts Stewart. Stewart's testimony is the outlier, but it's the only evidence given that suggests that Spangler did something to assist Booth in his escape. Also, remember that Stewart said that he told Police Superintendent A.C. Richards, he was actually the chief of the Metropolitan Police, that he was certain that the gunman was J. Wilkes Booth. Richards did not testify at the trial, but years later he exchanged correspondence with Louis Weichmann, in which Weichmann shared chapters from his unfinished manuscript about the assassination. After he mentioned Stewart's testimony, Richards wrote back, "I suggest that you make it clear that those statements are Stewart's and not from your own personal knowledge." Why? I say this for the reason that Stewart drew largely upon his imagination when he gave his testimony as to what transpired immediately after the shot was fired. Richards said that he was on the stage with Stewart shortly after Booth left, and cautions Weichmann, "No such scene as you describe as part of Stewart's testimony occurred there. The statement is apocryphal and imaginary." Unfortunately, Richards didn't think it was worthwhile to express this in 1865. He said that during the trial he thought the accounts of Stewart's testimony that he read in the newspapers were exaggerated by reporters. But no matter. Stewart's testimony in no way affected the interests of the defendants in the trial, he wrote Weichmann. Seriously? Nothing could be further from the truth. If your account is correct, sir, then Edmund Spangler did not slam the back door shut, and an innocent man was sentenced to 6 years at hard labor. And Judge Bingham and the Commission and the President and pretty much the whole world owe Edmund Spangler an apology. Then began the next chapter of Ned's life, his imprisonment in Fort Jefferson on the Dry Tortugas. I will admit that I was surprised to learn, after reading in Samuel Arnold's memoirs about the endless horror of the place, that Spangler did not find it to be an unabating hell. Bogart tells us that Spangler requested a carpentry assignment, which he turned to good use. In addition to making furniture for his 3 cellmates, Sam Arnold, Michael Laughlin, and Dr. Mudd, he made handcrafted items for sale to the soldiers, occasionally earning more than he did at Ford's Theater. Once he was making repairs at the Fort doctor's house, and he told the doctor's wife that while he was entirely innocent of the Lincoln affair, quote, "I suppose I have done enough in my life to deserve this, so I will make the best of it," unquote. He continued to protest his innocence in a letter that wound up in a Baltimore newspaper, writing, "Before God, who I know will find me accountable if I lie, I knew nothing, heard nothing about the existence of any such a thing until after the assassination." Booth had merely asked him to see to his stabled horses, which I did. He said that he would make me a handsome present, which he did. 6 years on the island of Dry Tortugas. In the yellow fever epidemic that felled O'Loughlin and saw Samuel Mudd take over the medical response following the death of the Fort doctor, Mudd himself fell ill, and Spangler helped nurse him to health. Meantime, he assembled coffins for the 37 casualties of the fever. After serving 4 years of his 6-year term, Ned was pardoned along with Mudd and Arnold in 1869. John T. Ford, who never gave up his efforts on Ned's behalf, hired him back to work at his theaters in Baltimore. After working 4 years for Ford, Spangler's health began to fail, upon which the still grateful Dr. Mudd invited him to live and work at his farm. He did so for 1.5 years before dying in 1875. I want to acknowledge yet another book, Decapitating the Union by John Fazio. I came across him when I was looking for sources that support Spangler's innocence. But I feel compelled to report that Fazio's main thesis is that the Confederate government, including President Jefferson Davis, most certainly orchestrated the assassination, a contention not satisfactorily demonstrated at the trial, nor given much currency since. In other aspects of the case, Fazio finds credible some sources that other historians pointedly ignore. Does this cast doubt on his exoneration of Spangler? Not necessarily. He goes into much more detail than I did, closely considering the testimony of 9 witnesses against Spangler and reaching sound conclusions. So, like with Bogar, who provides a wealth of interesting and worthwhile detail but calmly condemns Spangler, I will pick and choose what I find most believable from the sources. See the problem with history? How did Booth break his ankle? On the stage or under his horse? Was Mudd guilty or not? Was Spangler guilty or not? And now we move on to the most controversial conspirator, Mary Surratt. Was she guilty? Yes, she was guilty. And I will prove it with abundant circumstantial evidence in episode 21. See you then.